Welcome to this video series on decision-making and plagiarism and dealing with gray zones across academic fields. This is the first of 3 videos. I will give you an introduction to plagiarism. The 3 videos in this series were also part of a live webinar at Elsevier's Researcher Academy. My name is Melanie Rügenhagen and I am manager of and researcher at the HEAD Center, which is short for Humboldt-Elsevier Advanced Data and Text Center, where we focus our research on educational efforts and research integrity. Now let us begin with the introduction to plagiarism. The quotes you can see on this slide are a good starting point for thinking about plagiarism. In his book Quantifying Research Integrity, Michael Seidel framed plagiarism as, and I quote, "a problem that comes from a lack of creativity, copying the expression of others." End of quote. He also writes, and I quote again, "Plagiarism is hard to define in any precise way. At the simplest level, it is copying texts from other authors and using them as if they were their own." End of quote. Now, that does not yet define what plagiarism is, but it gives us an idea of where the problem has its roots and what we are dealing with as opposed to other research integrity issues like data falsification. There are indeed many definitions of plagiarism, and there is certainly a common understanding that blunt and intentional copying of text without attributing that text to its actual author is plagiarism. But there is more to plagiarism than that. There are details and cases where decisions and judgments are not that easy, and those are the reason why we provide you with this video series. We introduce you to the grayscales of the whole issue of plagiarism. Note that we often deal with text when it comes to plagiarism. In this video series, we also give you an introduction to the concept of image plagiarism, which may be defined as a part of image manipulation, but strictly speaking, copying and reusing images without proper attribution is a matter of plagiarizing. My colleague Thorsten Beck will tell you more about this in the next video. In addition to images, also sound and video can be plagiarized. Plagiarism.org, which is sponsored by the company Turnitin, which sells the plagiarism checking software Authenticate, gives a few examples of what is considered plagiarism beyond text from their perspective. One example is, and I quote, "copying media, especially images, from other websites to paste them into your own papers or websites." End of quote. This is what you can see here in the picture. This is a screenshot of our own HEAD Center website. You can see how easy it is to copy an image. And because this is so quick and simple, forgetting the reference can happen by accident. But this is not necessarily all. Many universities establish pages on their websites that explain the whole issue of plagiarism. And those pages sometimes include lists of what this university or one disciplinary department at the school regard as acceptable and unacceptable in writing. The University of Guelph in Canada, for example, adds to the already mentioned items, I quote, "ideas, data, computer programming, products of any other creative endeavor." End of quote. Mind you, we do not necessarily agree with all these examples coming from plagiarism.org and the University of Guelph. Ideas and code are especially controversial. With the video series, we want to encourage a discussion about what can be considered plagiarism. Whether text or not, most prevalent in our minds may be instances where somebody intentionally plagiarized. Important to keep in mind, however, is that plagiarism does not necessarily imply intention and guilt. Plagiarism can be the result of sloppy work and time pressure. Someone who plagiarized might not even be aware that they did. At the HEAD Center, we advocate to look into the details of a case and distinguish between multiple gradients of severity, in order to be fair to those who did not mean harm or fell victim to an accusation that has an extremely strict view on plagiarism. This brings us to the question as to what can be considered plagiarism, because defining what instance is to be labeled plagiarism sheds light on whether someone can be considered guilty. This question, however, is impossible to answer in one sentence. If we want to identify where the boundary between a minor issue and intentional plagiarism has been crossed, we need to look at the details. Let's stick with text plagiarism for now. Thinking about text, those details include counting matching words, determining the intellectual similarity between two texts, identifying whether words or phrases are very common in some context or even across contexts, which would be regular common knowledge found in textbooks, but also the discipline-based customs of writing, which can be different in the natural sciences than, for example, in the social sciences. Reusing texts is in some disciplines more common than in others. This has to be taken into account. In determining what can be considered plagiarism, so-called plagiarism types or categories bring us a step closer to the goal. Examples of this come from the University of Guelph as well as from VroniPlag Wiki. You can see a screenshot of the VroniPlag Wiki website on the slide. VroniPlag Wiki assembles cases of plagiarism. Behind it stand people who analyze works, such as dissertations. Their system includes 4 main categories. The original names are in German because the website is in German. I'm translating them here as complete plagiarism, cover-up, pawn sacrifice, as well as translation plagiarism. Let me explain those types quickly. On this and on the next slide, you can see more or less literal translations of the German definitions of the VroniPlag Wiki website. Complete plagiarism means that, I quote, the text in question is completely or almost unaltered compared to a text found in a source that was created before the text in question without making this obvious. End of quote. A cover-up is an, and I quote, instance where text deviates from text in an earlier source to the extent that the text uses different words to the same effect or partly the same words without making this obvious. End of quote. The very brief description of a pawn sacrifice is, and I quote, insufficient reference. End of quote. For example, this would include giving a perfectly correct reference for a quoted passage, but then continuing the quotation or paraphrasing without making that explicit. For a more detailed explanation, you can also check the VroniPlag Wiki website. Translation plagiarism includes, and I quote, translating a text literally or using words to the same effect, end of quote, without giving the proper reference. The VroniPlag Wiki team acknowledged on their website that there are often no exact translations, which means translation involves interpretation. The University of Guelph defines a lot more types, which you can see here, such as, and I quote, paraphrasing too closely, even if you do credit the source, end of quote. Again, some of this may be controversial. That is, these types defined by VroniPlag Wiki and the University of Guelph do not necessarily reflect our own opinion. And they also do not, and this is important, have to reflect other people's opinions who are in the position to make decisions as to whether or not somebody plagiarized. This is to be viewed with caution. In the last part of this video series, we will provide a closer look at how we at the Head Center view plagiarism categories. We will show you how one can measure and even quantify plagiarism using the grayscale approach that Michael Seidel has developed in the course of several years. Now let us look at the concept of originality. In the beginning, we established that plagiarism, in a sense, is a lack of creativity. This is closely tied to originality. If we say one may not copy words or phrases or even thoughts, then this means that everything would have to be purely original. Now we may ask ourselves, is that possible? Let's look at a definition of originality to find out. Lexico.com, for example, says originality is, and I quote, the ability to think independently and creatively, end of quote. Independent and creative thinking is not in all cases represented by a unique set of words. There are many common expressions in our world's vocabularies, and just as many in each discipline's vocabulary. Those are not all subject to plagiarism. They are subject to being reused in a completely legitimate manner in order to reflect upon certain discoveries or, for example, common known conditions. They are subject to being reused in a completely legitimate manner in order to reflect upon certain discoveries or, for example, commonly known conditions. Originality and how people from different disciplines view originality not only defines what is plagiarism, but also what it is not. And in that sense, what is not plagiarism is to some extent up for discussion. The clear violations where authors copy text or images or data are not the issue. Less clear cases are more of a problem. At the Head Center, we make use of a grayscale of categories. An example from this grayscale is the already mentioned common knowledge. Of course, we are copying what is widely known. We build on facts and use common wordings. What is to be considered common in a discipline, however, is sometimes so specific and intransparent to anyone who is not familiar with that discipline that a judgment as to whether plagiarism has occurred must come from an expert in that discipline. Other instances that are not plagiarism become most obvious when looking at particular cases, because this is simply often case-specific. We will look at cases in the last part of this video series. In the second part, we take a look at image plagiarism. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to contact us at info@het.eu.